The poor Omega opened a window at night, woke to the ruthless Alpha King bleeding inside. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Emily Carter had learned the language of the night long before the pack decided she was invisible. She knew how the wind pressed against the pine boards of her one-room cabin at the edge of the territory, how the moonlight slipped through the thin curtains like a quiet apology, how silence could be heavier than words. Being a poor Omega meant surviving on small mercies and smaller expectations, and tonight felt like every other night until the air changed. It wasn't loud, not a crash or a cry, just a shift in pressure that made her pause with one hand on the kettle, a subtle metallic scent riding the breeze like a warning she didn't understand yet. The window rattled once, soft enough to be mistaken for the weather, and Emily crossed the room barefoot, her steps careful on the old wooden floor that creaked if she moved too fast. She told herself she was only checking the latch, only letting in fresh air, but when she lifted the sash an inch, the cold slipped inside, and with it a presence that made her heart stutter. She closed the window again and waited, counting her breaths, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, until the night settled back into its familiar rhythm. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in uneasy dreams of running without a pack, of hands glowing faintly and then fading, of eyes in the dark that did not blink. Morning found her disoriented, the pale light of dawn stretching across the floorboards, and that was when she saw him. He lay just inside the room as if the shadows had set him there, tall and still, his dark coat soaked through at the side, breathing shallow but steady. Emily froze, fear tightening her chest, because even wounded he radiated authority, the kind that pressed on her instincts and told her to kneel or flee. She did neither. She noticed details instead, the way his jaw clenched as if holding back pain, the calm severity etched into his features, the faint heat rolling off him despite the cold. She backed away, grabbed clean cloth from the shelf, and knelt at a cautious distance, telling herself she would call for help, telling herself she would do the sensible thing, while her hands moved on their own. The fabric darkened as she pressed it carefully, not to harm, not to intrude, only to stop what she could, whispering apologies to a stranger who might wake and decide she was a threat. The room felt too small for the power coiled there, too fragile for the weight of what she had allowed inside by opening a window an inch. And yet, as his breathing evened, Emily realized with a quiet certainty that this night had already rewritten her life, because whoever he was, he had crossed her threshold, and she had chosen to let him stay. Emily Carter did not sleep after that. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the thin mattress barely creaking beneath her weight, listening to the stranger's breathing and the quiet tick of the old clock on the wall. Every instinct she had told her this man was dangerous, not because he moved or spoke, but because the air itself seemed to bend around him, as if her small cabin were holding its breath. She kept the lamp low, its warm glow catching on the rough wood walls and the clean cloth pressed at his side, and she focused on ordinary things to keep herself steady: the chipped mug on the table, the kettle she had forgotten to pour, the steady rhythm of dawn birds beginning to stir outside. When he shifted slightly, a sound escaped her before she could stop it, a soft gasp that made her freeze. His eyes did not open, but his brow tightened as if he were wrestling something unseen, and Emily found herself speaking quietly, telling him to rest, telling herself the same thing. She had no healer's training, only the strange sensitivity that had always made others uncomfortable, the way she could feel when a room was heavy with anger or when someone nearby was close to breaking. Now that awareness hummed in her hands as she checked the cloth, careful and respectful, making sure she did not cause more harm. Outside, the pack lands were waking up, boots on gravel, voices carrying faintly through the trees, and fear threaded through her calm. If anyone came to her door and found him here, there would be questions she could not answer and consequences she could not survive. She closed the curtains tighter and moved the chair against the door, a small barrier that felt laughable and yet necessary. As the morning light strengthened, the stranger finally stirred, his breathing changing, his shoulders tensing before his eyes opened. They were a pale, unsettling gray, sharp even through fatigue, and they fixed on her with a focus that made her pulse quicken. He did not reach for her or speak right away, only took in the room, the lamp, the chair, the window, and then her, as if committing everything to memory. Emily straightened without thinking, her spine lifting, meeting his gaze because looking away felt like surrender. She told him he was safe for now, that he should not try to move, that help was not far if he needed it, though she did not know how true that last part was. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled, thanking her without gratitude, more like acknowledgement, and asking where he was. She answered simply, giving the name of the territory but not her own, watching his reaction closely. Something flickered in his eyes, not surprise but calculation, and he closed them again as if the effort cost him more than he would admit. Emily stood there for a long moment, the weight of him and the risk of her choice settling into her bones. She realized then that opening the window had not been an accident at all, but a test she had already passed, and whether this stranger stayed an hour or a lifetime, the night had drawn a line she could not step back across. The hours that followed moved strangely, stretched thin by vigilance and quiet choices that felt heavier than they should have. Emily kept her movements deliberate, measuring water into a glass, dampening a cloth, checking the room for anything out of place, all while aware of the man's presence, as if he were a second heartbeat in the cabin. When he woke again, it was to the sound of the kettle finally pouring, steam sighing into the cool air, and he watched her with that same assessing calm that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. She told him her name then, because keeping it felt like a lie that might cost her later, and he nodded once as if accepting a fact rather than meeting a person. He asked for nothing more than water and a moment to gather himself, and when she offered soup, he declined without offense, explaining he would rest better without it. The restraint in his voice unsettled her more than any demand would have, and she found herself speaking to fill the space, explaining the pack routines, the times when patrols passed near her place, the safest hours when no one bothered an Omega who lived alone. He listened without interrupting, storing details, his attention sharp even as fatigue tugged at him. Outside, a pair of voices drifted close, laughing, boots crunching on gravel, and Emily's breath caught until they moved on, the sound fading back into the trees. She realized then that fear had sharpened her senses, that the world felt louder, brighter, as if the night had left a mark on her. The man closed his eyes for a while, conserving strength, and Emily used the time to think through what came next, how long she could keep him hidden, how quickly rumors traveled, how little mercy the pack showed to those who broke unspoken rules. When he finally spoke again, he asked why she had helped him, not as an accusation but as a question that demanded honesty. Emily told him the truth she knew, that she could not ignore someone in need, that leaving him outside would have haunted her longer than any punishment. He considered that, the corner of his mouth tightening briefly, and said that kindness was rarer than strength, which was why it was often misunderstood. As the afternoon light slanted across the floor, he tried to rise and stopped at her sharp intake of breath, yielding to her insistence that he wait, that whatever urgency he felt could be delayed another hour. He agreed, surprising her again, and in that pause something settled between them, an unspoken pact born of necessity and trust. Emily noticed then the subtle signs she had missed before, the way the room seemed to respond to him, the quiet pull she felt like gravity drawing her closer without a step taken. She shook it off, focusing on practical things, but the sense lingered, gentle and persistent. When dusk approached, he asked about the window, and she admitted she had opened it without knowing why, that the night had called to her in a way she could not explain. His eyes opened fully at that, studying her with renewed interest, and he said softly that some doors did not open by chance. As darkness returned, Emily braced herself for the choice ahead, understanding now that sheltering him was not just an act of compassion, but the beginning of a path she could not yet see, one that would test her quiet strength against a world that had never expected her to matter. Night settled fully around the cabin, wrapping it in a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were listening. Emily moved through her small space with practiced care, lighting the lamp again, checking the latch, and setting a bowl of water near the bed without being asked. The The man watched her from where he rested, his attention steady, and when she finally sat across from him, he spoke her name with a measured softness that made her look up. He said he would need to leave before dawn, that staying longer would put her at risk, and the certainty in his tone told her this was not a suggestion. Emily nodded, even as a knot tightened in her chest, because she understood danger better than most. She had lived on the edge of it all her life, unseen until something went wrong. Still, she asked where he would go, and he answered only that he would reach his people, that arrangements would be made. The distance in that phrasing stirred questions she did not voice. As the hours passed, they spoke in fragments, about the forest paths that wound beyond her cabin, about the old well that never froze, about the way the moon rose earlier this time of year. It felt like filling the space with ordinary things to keep something larger at bay. At one point, a sudden knock echoed faintly from far down the trail, not at her door, but close enough to make her heart race, and the man's body tensed instantly, control snapping into place despite his condition. Emily held up a hand, listening, counting breaths again until the sound faded, and only then did he ease back, regarding her with something like respect. He told her she was braver than she realized, and she almost laughed, because bravery had never felt like this. It felt like staying still when running would be easier. Later, as the fire burned low, she noticed the change in him, subtle but undeniable, his color improving, his presence sharpening, as if the cabin itself could no longer contain what he carried. He caught her watching and said quietly that whatever happened next, she had his word she would not be harmed because of him. The promise carried weight, not because of how it was spoken, but because of how completely he believed it. Emily swallowed and said she had not helped him for protection or reward, that she only did what she thought was right. He studied her for a long moment, and in that silence she felt again the pull she could not explain, a sense of alignment like pieces clicking into place. When he finally spoke, he told her that choices made in the dark often shaped destinies more than those made in daylight, and that opening a window was sometimes enough to change the course of many lives. Near midnight, he slept more deeply, and Emily allowed herself to sit back, exhaustion catching up with her, her thoughts drifting to what she would say if asked about the stranger, to how she would explain the lingering sense of connection that hummed under her skin. She did not know his name yet, and part of her wondered if knowing it would make everything harder. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying distant howls that made her shiver, and she realized with a quiet certainty that whatever dawn brought, she would meet it standing, because this night had already proven that even a poor Omega could hold the weight of a king's fate without breaking. The first hint of dawn crept in slowly, a pale gray that softened the edges of the room and made everything feel fragile and temporary. Emily rose before the light fully claimed the sky, moving quietly as if sound itself might betray them. The man was awake already, sitting upright now, his posture steadier, his presence filling the small cabin in a way it had not before. He looked stronger, not healed but contained, as if sheer will had stitched him together enough to move. She offered him water again, and this time he drank more deeply, watching her over the rim of the glass with a focus that made her cheeks warm. When he spoke, his voice carried a subtle urgency, telling her it was time, that he could not risk the sun finding him here. Emily nodded, though the word time echoed painfully in her chest, because it meant endings she was not ready to name. She handed him a coat, too large for her, but serviceable, and showed him the narrow path behind the cabin that cut through the trees and led toward the ridge. He listened closely, memorizing turns and landmarks, then paused, his gaze sharpening as if he sensed something beyond her hearing. Emily did too, a distant pressure, not sound exactly but awareness, the pack stirring earlier than usual. Fear fluttered in her stomach, and for a moment she imagined everything collapsing, imagined voices at her door, imagined blame settling on her shoulders like a sentence. He seemed to read it in her face and stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, lowering his voice to promise again that she would not stand alone in what came next. The words steadied her more than she expected. At the door, he hesitated, then finally gave her his name, Adrian, as if it were a gift rather than a fact. The way he said it carried weight, and Emily knew without knowing why that names mattered in this world more than titles. She repeated it once, quietly, and something shifted between them, subtle and undeniable. Outside, the air was cold and clean, the forest holding its breath as if marking the moment. Adrian turned back once more, his eyes lingering on her with an intensity that made her feel seen all the way through, and said that if the world had been kinder, they might have met under different circumstances, but that fate rarely waited for comfort. Then he was gone, moving with surprising grace into the trees, his presence fading but not disappearing, like a storm passing beyond the horizon. Emily stood in the doorway long after he vanished, the silence rushing back and around her, louder now for having been broken. When she finally closed the door, the cabin felt different, larger and emptier at the same time, as if it remembered him. She cleaned carefully, not erasing him but restoring order, folding the cloth, setting the chair back in place, grounding herself in routine. Yet beneath it all, something hummed, a quiet awareness that had not been there before, a sense of connection stretching outward like a thread pulled taut. As the morning wore on, voices did come closer, curious, probing, and Emily met them with calm answers and steady eyes, surprised by her own composure. No one accused her, no one lingered. But when they left, she knew it was only a matter of time before questions found her again. She sat by the window she had opened and closed, sunlight warming her face, and understood with a clarity that both frightened and strengthened her that the night had chosen her as much as she had chosen it. And whatever destiny Adrian carried back to his people, a part of it had been left with her, waiting for the moment it would demand to be claimed. Days passed, marked not by events, but by a subtle shift in how the world responded to Emily Carter. She noticed it first in small ways, the way neighbors paused a fraction longer when they saw her, the way conversations quieted when she walked by, not with suspicion but with uncertainty, as if something about her no longer fit the simple shape they had assigned. She kept to her routines, gathering supplies, tending the small garden behind her cabin, reminding herself that nothing had changed, even as the quiet thread she felt stretching beyond her chest grew more distinct. At night, she dreamed of silver eyes watching from the edge of the trees, not threatening, not distant, simply present, and she woke with the sense that she was no longer alone in the dark. On the third evening after Adrian left, the pressure returned, sharper this time, a pull that made her stop mid-step with her hand on the doorframe. She closed her eyes and listened, not with her ears but with that inner awareness she had always tried to ignore, and realized it was not fear she felt, but recognition. The forest felt alive around her, attentive, as if waiting for her to notice it back. Emily stepped outside, the air cool against her skin, and stood beneath the rising moon, grounding herself the way she always had, breathing slowly, letting the night settle into her bones. The sensation eased but did not vanish, leaving behind a calm certainty that something had been set in motion beyond her reach. The following morning brought news carried on hushed voices and widened eyes, rumors of unrest far from her cabin, of leadership shifts and unanswered questions, none of it spoken plainly, but all of it heavy with implication. Emily listened without asking, keeping her face neutral, though Adrian's name echoed silently in her mind with every fragment she heard. That afternoon, a knock came at her door, measured and respectful, and when she opened it she found a courier standing at a careful distance, his posture formal. He did not cross her threshold, only handed her a sealed note, and said she was to read it alone. Emily waited until he left before breaking the seal, her fingers steady despite the way her pulse quickened. The message was brief, written with controlled precision, thanking her for her discretion and telling her that the debt she was owed would be honored in time, that until then she should trust her instincts and remain where she was. There was no signature, only a symbol pressed into the wax, one she did not recognize but somehow understood mattered. Emily folded the note carefully and placed it beneath the lamp, the weight of it settling over her like a mantle she had never asked for. As evening fell, she sat by the window again, watching the forest darken, aware that the choice she had made was unfolding in ways she could not yet see. She thought of Adrian, of the restraint in his voice, the certainty in his promises, and wondered what kind of world required a man like him to move through shadows. When a sudden warmth flared in her chest, brief but unmistakable, she pressed a hand there, startled, and felt the echo of something distant answering back. Emily did not panic. She closed her eyes and accepted the sensation, understanding now that whatever she carried was not a burden but a connection, one that tied her to a fate larger than the narrow limits she had been given. The night deepened, stars bright above the trees, and Emily Carter stood quietly at the edge of everything she had known, steady and awake, ready for whatever would come next. The summons came at dusk, delivered not by a courier this time, but by a presence that settled over the land like a held breath. Emily felt it before she saw anything, a quiet insistence that drew her from the cabin and onto the path she rarely used, the one that curved toward the old clearing where moonlight gathered even on cloudy nights. She did not question it, only wrapped herself in her coat and walked, the forest opening for her with a familiarity that felt earned. When she reached the clearing, figures stood at its edge, not surrounding her, but waiting, their posture respectful, their attention careful. They wore no insignia she recognized, yet the air around them carried a disciplined calm that made her straighten without fear. One stepped forward and addressed her by name, not as an order but as a request, asking if she would come with them to speak with their leader. Emily hesitated only long enough to steady her breathing, then agreed, understanding that refusing would not return her to the life she had before. The journey was swift and quiet, guided through familiar woods that somehow felt different, as if the land itself were aligning to a deeper pattern. When they arrived, the space was simple and open, lanterns set low, nothing ornate, nothing meant to intimidate. And there he was. Adrian stood waiting, whole in a way that made her catch her breath, his presence no longer contained by injury or shadow. The restrained power she had sensed before now moved with purpose, undeniable and clear, and when his gaze met hers, the thread she felt tightened into certainty. He spoke first, not with flourish but with honesty, telling her that the man she had sheltered was not merely a traveler or a leader among many but the one whose decisions shaped the territory she lived in. He did not use the title at first, as if sparing her the weight of it, but when he finally said it, the words settled without shock, because her instincts had already known. Ruthless Alpha King was what others called him, he said, not with pride but with acknowledgement, a name earned through choices made to protect more than himself. Emily listened, heart steady, surprised by her calm, because the revelation did not change the memory of the man who had thanked her quietly or promised she would not stand alone. Adrian continued, explaining that he had been targeted, that moving unseen had been necessary, and that her cabin had offered not just shelter but clarity. He told her that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and that her choice had reminded him why restraint mattered as much as strength. When he asked if she felt deceived, Emily considered the question carefully and answered truthfully that she felt chosen, not tricked, because he had never demanded anything from her that night. The clearing seemed to breathe with them, the witnesses silent, and Adrian did something unexpected. He bowed his head, just slightly, an acknowledgement meant for her alone, and declared that the debt he owed was not one of gold or protection but of recognition. He said her safety was now his concern, her voice welcome in matters that touched her life, and that no one would dismiss her again without answering to him. The words carried authority, but it was the sincerity beneath them that anchored her. Emily felt the warmth in her chest respond, steady and bright, and she understood that the window she opened had led here, to a truth revealed not by force but by trust. As the moon rose higher, Adrian offered his hand, not as a command but as an invitation, and Emily took it, aware that the path ahead would test them both, yet certain that destiny, once awakened, did not retreat. The transition from the clearing to the heart of Adrian's domain unfolded with a quiet precision that never once made Emily feel like a captive. She was given space, choices, and time, small mercies that spoke louder than ceremony. The path led them through stone corridors warmed by lantern light, past guards who lowered their heads not to Adrian, but to her, their acknowledgement subtle, yet unmistakable. Emily felt the weight of their attention and kept her shoulders square, grounding herself in steady breaths, reminding herself that dignity did not come from rank, but from how one carried what was offered. Adrian walked beside her, close enough that she felt the calm authority he radiated, yet careful never to crowd her. And when they reached a quiet chamber overlooking the forest, he invited her to sit, choosing a chair opposite rather than a throne. The gesture mattered. He spoke then of what came next, not in terms of destiny but of consequence, explaining that his people would notice her presence, that rumors would try to define her before she had a chance to speak for herself. Emily listened, fingers laced, her awareness tuned to the cadence of his voice and the honesty beneath it. She told him she did not want protection that erased her voice, that she would not become a symbol stripped of choice, and he surprised her by agreeing without hesitation. He said strength imposed was brittle, that loyalty earned endured, and that her consent in all things was not only respected but required. The words settled into her, easing a tension she had not realized she carried. As night deepened outside the tall windows, Emily felt the familiar warmth stir again, a gentle pulse that answered something within Adrian, subtle but synchronized. She did not recoil. She met his gaze and spoke of the pull she felt since the night she opened the window, the way it had grown into clarity rather than fear. Adrian listened intently, then shared a truth he rarely voiced, that ruling demanded constant restraint, that being ruthless was often a shield to prevent greater harm, and that her presence challenged him to remember the cost of forgetting compassion. The admission was not an apology but an offering, and Emily received it with quiet respect. When he stood and offered to walk her to her room, she accepted, noting again how every choice remained hers. The room prepared for her was simple and warm, a place meant for rest rather than display, and as he paused at the threshold, Adrian said that tomorrow he would present her to the council, not as an object of protection, but as a woman whose actions had altered the balance of his world. Emily considered the fear that flickered and found it outweighed by resolve. She agreed, knowing that visibility would test her more than solitude ever had. After he left, she stood by the window overlooking the forest, the same moonlight she knew tracing the floor, and felt the thread between them steady and strong. For the first time, the future did not feel like a threat pressing in from all sides, but like a path unfolding beneath her feet, demanding courage rather than sacrifice. Emily Carter closed her eyes and rested her hand over her heart, understanding that recognition had already begun, and that the quiet omega the world had ignored was about to be seen, not because a king had claimed her, but because she had chosen herself. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt ceremonial even without fanfare, light spilling through tall windows and settling across the chamber where the council gathered. Emily walked beside Adrian through the open doors, her steps measured, her posture steady, aware of every eye turning toward her and choosing not to shrink. The murmurs quieted as Adrian took his place, not above them, but among them, and he spoke without raising his voice, introducing Emily not as a guest or a curiosity, but as the woman whose judgment had preserved more than a life. He told the council of a night when caution failed and trust succeeded, of a choice made without expectation of reward, and he named that choice as the reason he stood before them whole. The room held still, weighing the words, and Emily felt the familiar warmth gather in her chest, not flaring but grounding her. When asked to speak, she did so plainly, describing what she had seen and what she had done, neither embellishing nor apologizing, meeting skepticism with calm and curiosity with honesty. Questions came, careful and sharp, and she answered them without deferring to Adrian, who watched with a quiet pride that did not intrude. One by one, resistance softened into consideration, then into respect, not because authority demanded it, but because consistency earned it. When the council concluded, Adrian rose and declared that Emily Carter would remain under his protection by her consent, that her voice would be heard in matters affecting the borders and the people who lived at their margins, and that no one would dismiss her again without consequence. The declaration was firm yet measured, and Emily felt its weight settle without fear. Outside, the day unfolded with a sense of release, sunlight warming stone and forest alike, and as they walked, Adrian spoke of rebuilding trust where it had been strained, of choosing transparency where secrecy had been habit. Emily listened and offered her own thoughts, surprised by how easily the exchange flowed, how naturally partnership replaced hierarchy. At the edge of the terrace, overlooking the trees that had first drawn them together, Adrian paused and acknowledged what lay between them, not naming it as fate or bond, but as a choice that would require patience and mutual respect. Emily appreciated the restraint, the space to decide without pressure, and she agreed that whatever grew would do so honestly or not at all. As evening approached, a messenger arrived with news of calms spreading through the territory, of questions answered and rumors losing their bite, and Emily realized that the ripple from her small act had widened into something enduring. When she returned to her room, she found the window open, the same gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine, and she smiled at the symmetry. She stood there for a moment, feeling the steady connection that no longer startled her, and understood that strength could be quiet and still command attention. Emily Carter closed the window at last, not to shut the night out, but to mark a beginning, confident that whatever came next would meet her standing, seen at last not for what she lacked, but for the courage she chose when it mattered most.